All right, welcome to Common Ground UF. This is our first event, and Common Ground UF is dedicated to having civil discussions about certain topics without having heated debates. This first event is about political violence, and we have two speakers here, Ioel and Wesley, talk about certain questions and answer certain questions about political violence. And yeah, we'll just go ahead and start with them. What do you think about political violence?
I guess I'll go first because I was handing the mic. First of all, I'm Yoel. I'm a second year sociology student. So if that suits the way that you understand the next things that I'm going to say, I think that the first thing that we should say that we both agreed on that we've talked about before we want to talk about this is that political violence is unacceptable. It's a last resort. Sometimes may be necessary. We'll get into that later. But at the end of the day, like political violence is not a good thing or nor a thing that should be necessarily encouraged. It's something that happens out of necessity.
Thank you, Ioel. And Wesley?
Hey everyone, I'm Wesley. I'm a fourth year industrial and systems engineering major. So not really in politics at all, but I've done a lot of political internships and that kind of thing. I would say political violence, I would agree with Yoel, reflects what's gone wrong in our country. I think when people get frustrated, it results in political violence, but that doesn't mean it's acceptable. We've seen lots of examples in the last few months of political violence, and it comes from both sides, but none of it is acceptable. And I think that our leaders in our country have a responsibility to provide moral leadership and not just to govern. And I think that that's where some of it starts.
Those are some great answers. Why is political violence? Yeah. Okay. Those are some great answers. Why do you think that political violence is so prevalent in America?
I think that there's stuff at the root of that question that I think is more productive to talk about than whether or not it is prevalent. I think that looking into it before this debate, political violence is not nearly as prevalent in the U.S. As in countries that are riddled with political instability. I think that's an important distinction to make before we talk about political violence. If you look at examples like China, like Russia, like Iran, like Colombia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Salvador, all of these countries have immense the examples of political violence that are much more severe or prevalent or day-to-day and felt than they are in the U.S. I think we're privileged to live in a great country where people are free to say what they want to say. If we were having the same discussion in certain countries, we wouldn't be allowed. So I think that that's an important preface to then say that political violence is a rising issue in the United States. There was a study that I looked up by the Journal of Democrats. Obviously, I don't have the actual source because I'm speaking, but if you want to look it up, says that according to registries on global terrorism, there's been a 5 times increase on political violence in the United States. And I think it's an issue that's worth talking about, but I think it's an issue that's worth prefacing by the fact that it is not an ongoing crisis. I think that's what I would like to talk about, but I'll let Wes talk for a bit because I've talked for a while.
Yeah, of course. Wesley?
I would say it's more prevalent in America right now, but it's not the greatest we've ever seen. I mean, we had a full-on civil war in the 1860s. I mean, I would say that's the greatest example of political violence our country's ever seen. Just before the Civil War, even before the Revolutionary War, we had the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Tea Party. That's definitely political violence. I was reading that they were doing stuff like tar and feathering British soldiers that were, just hanging out in Massachusetts and stuff. I mean, that's political violence that's been going on since before we were even a country. And we had the Burr-Hamilton duel. We had the Whiskey Rebellion. We had John Brown and Bleeding Kansas. We've had lots of examples of political violence in our history. And I think a lot of it is because we are such a free country. I think that sometimes people take this idea of freedom a little bit too far. We are the freest country on earth. There's no question about that. But sometimes people get a little bit crazy. And I think that that's where the political violence, a lot of it stems. Is these people, they think, oh, I'm free, I can do what I want, I got to preserve this freedom or whatever. And they do make rash decisions. So I think it's prevalent just because of the inherent nature of the United States being different from a lot of other countries in the sense of freedom.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think there's some other stuff worth saying that, I think the political violence has 100% of history and it's not the highest that it has been. I think that it also depends on how you define political violence. If you define political violence by the hands of the state or stuff like that, there's also examples that very recently of political violence, like Japanese internment, for example. I think that 100% I agree with Wes that it's not as much of an issue as it is right now. But I did want to mention things where, like, in the media, it would seem that way. And I think we both agree. I want to talk a little bit about how I think that the perception of crisis is a political tool. I think that politicians obviously want to make you think that there is a crisis in the country so that they can use it for political gain. Recently, we've seen examples of like Antifa being outlawed when Antifa is not necessarily an organized movement or a movement that has protest in and of itself. Like, it's not an organization, it's an ideology, which then becomes a political tool to shut down protests of your choice, which, regardless of which side you lean, is not a good thing. I don't think protests of your choice should be shut down as they disagree with your administration. I think one of the nice things about being in a free country is that you can disagree, that we can have this conversation, that you can have a protest. And so I think that political violence is worth talking about, but at the same time is not prevalent right now as it has been in the past.
You have any thoughts? All right. Who is or what is to blame for political violence?
Yeah, so there's a quote from an Ernest Hemingway book that says, "How did you go bankrupt?" And the response was 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. And so I think what we're seeing right now with this political violence in our country is a result of a decline of government responsibility in our country. It's a result of a decline of maybe personal character in our country. And I think that this has happened slowly and gradually over time. And now we're starting to see a little bit more of an explosion of this political violence. That's the suddenly part of that quote. For years, people have felt detached from the government, I would say. They feel like Washington, D.C. is so far away that, how on earth could they ever make an impact in D.C. with the policies that they care about? And so I think that sometimes when they get desperate, these people, they feel detached and they feel like they don't have any other way to get their feelings across, to get their policies in place, rather than resorting to political violence. So, I think a lot of it also comes down to the federal government trying to do so much when, originally our founders decided that they wanted a lot of responsibilities to be held within the states. And so I think when you have a breakdown of, this federal structure the founders intended, a lot of the time it results in frustrations on the national level that maybe would have only been confined to the state level in the past. So I think that that's where it comes from, is this slow, devolving of the government. But yeah.
Before I continue to add, if any of you guys want to scan the QR code and ask us questions, you're more than welcome to. So definitely go ahead and scan and check in just for like event purposes. But yeah, I agree with what Wes is saying. I think that political violence stems from a profound dissatisfaction with the government. I do think that I'd also like to link that with the sociological conditions of the actual country. I think that political instability and economic instability are great factors that contribute to the dissatisfaction that then engenders one wanting to commit violence against the state or commit political violence. I think when you look at I want to say political violence from the people, I think that it's worth considering the economic state of the country. I also think that it is a natural consequence of being a country that's so large that so many people are so dissatisfied with the country, because at the end of the day, there's 500 million people living in the United States in 50 different states with a million different beliefs who are bound to have dissatisfaction with the government. And so I do think that I agree that smaller governments should be more proactive in finding solutions, at least from an administrative side of government, to preventing political violence. But I think that because the system is so large, it now seems inaccessible to create change without inducing violence. And so I think that is worth talking about 100%. I also think that political violence can come from the hands of the state. I think that people don't talk about that necessarily enough. Obviously, if you look at international examples, you look at Russia with the Chechens, with Georgians, if you look at China with East Tibetans, if you look at the U.S. with arguably illegal immigrants, I think that certain kinds of political violence go untalked about when they're at the hands of the state. So I think that it's also worth talking about how political instability can then cause the government to then enforce control and create political violence.
All right, thank you. Wesley, you have any thoughts? All right. In the case of Charlie Kirk, is it on him or the people taking offense to his words? And what's the line of "you're allowed to say to the world within reason"?
I think people can take offense if they want to, like that's on them if they want to be offended by something that's being said. I think that when you have a large following like Charlie Kirk does, that, you get that following in the first place because people like what you're saying. But yeah, I think that the responsibility doesn't necessarily lie with because someone took offense. I think it's someone resorts to political violence because they're screwed up, you know. I don't think it's because they just take offense. But yeah, I think there's not necessarily a line of what you're allowed to say as long as you're not like inciting violence, which violence is a very clear definition, I would say, of infringing on someone else's right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or their property, the protection of their property. And so we'll kind of get onto that a little bit later. But I think that's the line, is the definition of violence. You shouldn't be encouraging that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yoel?
I agree with Wes for the most part. I think that obviously like free speech should be limited to political violence. And I think that I heard some very interesting political commentary on normal people committing political violence. I think that's the line with instability in a country, is when you see people who are normally functioning, who are sane, who are within reason, who believe that political violence is the only resort to being satisfied with their country. I think that's when you start having concerns about political violence rising in the country. And that's why Charlie Kirk's murder is so concerning, as far as I can tell, as far as my research goes. And also I have this file on me right now, is that the person who murdered Charlie Kirk was, at least until this happened, a normally functioning member of society. And so that indicates certain things to me that I think are worth rising concern. I think that people are very inclined to say, I'll use a historical example for this. When JFK died, Malcolm X was interviewed, and he very, very famously said that JFK's death was the chickens coming home to roost. He pulled back this statement almost immediately. It was like debunked or rebuked by the Nation of Islam, a million things. But I think that people are very inclined to making that same statement with Charlie Kirk. And I think that's incredibly wrong. I don't think he should have been murdered. But I do think that it's worth talking about the political violence that he had cited in his own rhetoric. I think that some of the things that he espoused, and obviously, once again, this does not warrant committing violence against them, but I think it does warrant the frustration of people, is not understanding that the certain things that he espoused, like, for example, maybe certain traditional family values, his views on abortion rights, his views on immigration, particularly his views on, for example, Chinese nationals not being able to purchase land in the United States, are all inherently, at least indirectly, contributing to political violence of some sort. And so I think that the conversation that's worth having on Charlie Kirk's death is what induces normal people to resort to political violence, and also what is the political violence that he espoused that would then lead people to believe that something like his death would be warranted. Any response?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that Charlie Kirk necessarily incited violence on his own. I think that he did say some things that were inflammatory, of course, but I think it's also the responsibility of citizens to educate themselves and understand that he's using rhetoric. You know, he's using these terms that don't necessarily, I mean, if he's using military-esque language, talking about maybe an invasion at the southern border, as he said, that was one of the quotes that I was reading from him earlier. You know, he doesn't necessarily mean like a full-fledged military invasion. But if someone, I guess, isn't educated, maybe they're taking that and they're taking it to the extreme. And so I think that the responsibility, it's not just on someone to use maybe less inflammatory rhetoric. It's also for people to educate themselves and realize, hey, I'm not going to be manipulated by this person that's using this funny language, you know. And unfortunately, I think that our education system has failed in that area specifically.
No, I agree 100%. I think that education is crucial, and I think that we'll talk about that when they ask us how do we think we should resolve this. And I think using less inflammatory language and polarizing language is also very, very crucial. So I agree 100%.
That's a great insight. Speaking on the same topic, does the size of his platform impact what he should say or should not say?
I mean, I don't think anyone with any size of platform should be encouraging violence. I don't necessarily think he did. I mean, I don't think he was going out telling people to shoot up places, that kind of thing. He wasn't doing that. Maybe his language was a little bit inflammatory, but there's a line between inflammatory language and actually calling someone to do violence, and I don't think that he crossed that. I think that everyone in this country is entitled to their opinion. Some people face the consequences of that. As long as their rights aren't being infringed upon, though, that is not, you shouldn't be forced to limit what you're saying, at least within a public setting. So that's how I feel about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's more to be said about whether Charlie Kirk was crossing the line with inflammatory language. I think that because of the real and obviously things that Charlie Kirk understood was the demographic of the people that he was reaching, I think that his language could have led to more violence than maybe you're giving him credit for, although the language itself might have been just inflammatory. And I think that he was aware of that to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, it was his job and it was his beliefs. And I think that the definition of integrity is that no matter how big your platform is, you always stand for your beliefs, whether those be right, left, up, down, whatever. So I think that there were certain things that he did that maybe weren't as integral, so to speak. I think that, obviously profiting off of certain cherry-picked clips from debates and stuff like that is not the most integral thing to do. But I do think that speaking for your beliefs at every level and every platform that you might have is something that demonstrates integrity. But yeah, on the term of like where the line is, free speech, that's what makes it so great to live in the United States, and what we talked about before about how political violence is not as much of an issue here, and it's because we can speak out about what we think and speak our minds, and we can have this very discussion here. So I think that even if it is inflammatory language or is this or is that, I think that everyone should have the right to say whatever they want, save like maybe saying like fire in a theater, it's a classic example, but I think that everyone should exercise their free speech.
I think at the end of the day, people are responsible for their own actions, and so to a certain extent, you could say that inflammatory language incited people to do things that they may not otherwise have done. But I think that, at the end of the day, these people who commit political violence, they're the ones responsible for that. That is their action that they chose to do. They may have chosen to listen to someone, and that's what incited them to that. But the person that was telling them something, if they weren't telling them directly to go, assassinate someone, then that's not on them. That's on the person who did the action in the first place, I would say. So, and that's how the legal framework works too in this country. It's not like you're going to get, arrested for if you didn't do the action yourself,
I agree to a certain extent. I think that obviously from a legal perspective and from a just moral accountability perspective, it is not the fault of the person who said the words or that incited certain kinds of violence. But I do think that it should be addressed to some extent. I think that when you're evaluating specifically at least Charlie Kirk and what he said, I think that not talking about how his rhetoric might have led to violence is kind of missing the key point here is what I'm trying to say. I think that 100% like he isn't accountable for the actions of the people that he spoke to, but I do think that it should be spoken to about how his rhetoric might have implied or directed people towards doing certain things. Obviously, he can't be held accountable for them, but it should be talked about how his rhetoric incited violence to some extent. I think the most specific example that I can think of is the popular support for the current detention policies of immigrants. I speak to this just being an immigrant myself, so to me, it's the most important issue. I think that's creating this idea of crisis at the border has then induced popular support for ICE raids and for other issues like that have induced like real violence. And I don't think that it's Charlie Kirk's fault, but I do think that his rhetoric inducing public support and painting certain things as crisis is what then leads to more faults or to more political violence, whether it be of his own fault or not. And so I think that, at the end of the day, it's what he believed in and it's a political violence that he thought was necessary. But I do think that it was, to a certain extent, incited by the popular support for Trump to get elected. The crisis at the border was a big platform point for him, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's just what I'm trying to get at.
So that's your words. All right. Is political violence necessary or does peaceful protest work?
I think we both agree on this point. I think in certain instances, political violence is necessary. That doesn't mean that it's good. It doesn't mean that we should condemn it. Whoever that passerby was, wise beyond their years. But I think that, like, if you look at any violent dictatorship, they're not just going to let up their power because you ask them pretty please. That's just a normal conclusion. If you look at any dictatorship throughout history, there are very, very rare instances where they haven't been deposed via military coup, via outside intervention, via sanctions, via violent actions to resist them. I think that if you look at any movement throughout history, for example, that was peaceful, there is some amount of violent counterpart that made their demands more useful to talk about. I think that the most interesting example to talk about that a lot of people don't know is in union disputes. In West Virginia, during the coal mining boom, there was a series of companies who owned most of the West Virginian coal mines, and they wouldn't pay their workers in real currency. They would pay them in company bucks, essentially, make them live in company towns where they would run the schools, and that's where they would use their currency. Essentially, imagine your company controls every aspect about your life, and if you're fired, I mean, imagine that's not a good thing. So that was obviously an incentive not to unionize. When these mine workers eventually unionized and decided to protest peacefully and engaged in certain skirmishes where there was violence, they were constantly denied their demands for a normal wage. Check weighmans would verify that they were objectively paid for their hours. An 8-hour work week, basic things like that. They were denied up front. They created a movement where 13,000 miners gathered and were mobilized and were ready to fight back. And before they decided to fight, they went to Charleston, I think is the capital of West Virginia, to talk to the governor, gave him the demands that he finally decided to listen to, and they were just rejected flat out, not even a compromise. And so when you see a situation like that, you understand why political violence in some situations might be understood as necessary, because the coal companies receiving that amount of profit are not going to let go of that profit because you asked for it. I think at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that peaceful protest doesn't or can't have success, but I do think that in certain situations, political violence is necessary.
I think I would take a more limited view of when political violence is necessary, but I do think that the founding documents and founding events of our country do justify political violence in very, very limited situations. I mean, that was one of the things that Thomas Jefferson wrote about in the Declaration of Independence, was when you're under a tyrannical government, throw it off. It's your duty to throw it off. That's what he said in the Declaration. And so I think that is type of situation where something like political violence is justified. I don't think we're anywhere close to that in the United States right now. But I also think that's the whole reason we had the Second Amendment. It wasn't necessarily for self-defense. It wasn't for hunting. It was so that we could throw off a tyrannical government if we needed to. And so I think you look at the country of Venezuela right now as a great example. They're not allowed to have guns, unless they had them illegally. A lot of organized crime in Venezuela, but they can't throw off the Maduro regime because they don't have access to the firearms to do that. And so I think that, it is definitely a responsibility of citizens to do that under tyranny, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that in the United States right now to where political violence is justified. And I think, we've seen the success of peaceful movements, peaceful protest movements, like the women's suffrage movement, like the civil rights movement. A lot of these actually started in Christianity, started from the church. And so I think that's a pretty stark contrast to, trying to go attack people with guns versus, starting from a church. And I think that that's a much better way to achieve change, real change in the human heart and human condition, that's going to stop political violence.
I agree. I think that political violence is 100% a last resort, and I want to emphasize that before I continue to talk about instances where political violence was necessary. I agree with Wes 100% that the country in most instances is not in need of political violence, nor at that point or a point where peaceful protest can't be done. And I do think that it should be a last resort where peaceful protests can succeed, like the women's suffrage movement. It absolutely should be the primary method of organizing. In most movements, it should be the primary method of organizing. But that doesn't mean, often movements historically are credited to only be a peaceful movement, when I think that the role that political violence played in the movement is underplayed, and I think to a certain extent is pacifying to people organizing in peaceful protests. When you look at, for example, the dichotomy that people paint between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, they often paint Martin Luther King as someone who is entirely peaceful and Malcolm X as someone who is entirely violent, where in reality, both of their movements, to some extent, worked in tandem, where the political violence and the resistance of the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, as faulted as it was, which it absolutely was faulted. There's a lot of instances of, sexism within the Black Panther Party, of instances of anti-Semitism within the Nation of Islam. But as faulted as they were, the pressure that they put through violence into the government, evidenced by obviously the government's reaction, is a fundamental part of why the Civil Rights Act was passed. The peaceful protest obviously was the main part. The Freedom Riders, the walk to Alabama, all of these things were very, very important. But I think that political violence is often underplayed. And I'm not saying that to say that political violence is a good thing, but I am saying that to say that, it takes more than a protest sometimes to overturn the way that the government acts about things. But where a peaceful protest, can be the way that you enact things, it should be, if that makes sense.
I would say one thing that the beauty of our country is we have 50 different states that are all under one federal government. But, and we've seen this in the past. If you don't like what's going on in your state or where you live, you have 49 other states to choose from where you can go move. And honestly, that's been the legacy of America. I mean, you look at Latter-day Saints, for example, started in New York, moved to Missouri. They were persecuted there. So they moved out to Utah and they, made their own way out there. And so I think that, that's the beauty of our country is if you don't like what's going on where you are, you can go somewhere else. And because of that, that's why I don't think the political violence necessarily is justified in today's time, just because, and you saw this after the Civil War too, mass migration from the South to the North of newly freed slaves, So because that's an option, that's why I think we shouldn't have to resort to political violence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, for the sake of saying, I agree 100%. We're not at the point right now where we need political violence in the United States, at least not in most issues. And I do think that the first resort should always be peaceful. Yeah.
Sounds good. But what counts as political violence? What's the line between protest and violence?
Sure. I think violence has a very clear definition. I think it's when someone is infringing or violating on the rights of someone else. And that's what the government, that is the number one role of government, is to protect people from doing that. And so I think that, combating political violence should be a priority for the government, based on that fact. It's the fundamental role of government to protect people from violence. Thank you. Anyway, so if a protest gets to the point that it is preventing someone or hurting someone, hurting their life or their liberty, or damaging their property, that's when it's not a protest anymore, and that's when it's just flat out political violence.
I agree. I think rioting is a form of political violence. I think in certain instances, rioting seems like the only option, which I want to give credit to when I'm talking about rioting. I think that it is a form of political violence that is the last resort. It should not be acceptable when you can peacefully protest, and I agree with that 100%. But for example, when you look at riots due to the Black Lives Matter protests, I think there's an immense frustration that we're like maybe incapable of understanding as not being like members who grew up in those communities and understood political violence for such a long time, to have an outlet for your frustration and then that induces rioting because of dissatisfaction with the government. I think is something that is not in and of itself, like it isn't without cause, if that makes sense. And so I think that political violence, I agree 100%, is when you infringe on the rights of another, and I'd also qualify rioting as political violence. But I want to say that most times the most productive discussions that can be had about political violence are about causes and about ways to mediate. And so that's what I would like to focus on, if that makes sense.
I apologize. It's okay.
Okay. Is interpersonal relationship violence political violence, and do legal issues constitute political violence?
So this question in particular, I think me and Co talked about after I told him about a conversation that I had with my girlfriend. I'd like to credit her for this question because she helped me think about this differently. But she read a book essentially that said it was called Men Who Hate Women, and it was talking about the manosphere and about forms of like violent crime. It's a statistic that's often not talked about, that 80% of violent crime, and you can fact check me on this, I think it's like 75 or 80% of violent crime is committed by men. And how that isn't looked like as a trend that indicates something wrong with the gender role of men in society. I do, however, think that that's not necessarily political violence. I think that I would call that structural violence. And I think that the line is delineated in whether a social structure causes it outside of politics, or whether a politician is involved in it, or political rhetoric is involved in it. I think that certain political rhetoric feeds these structures, like, for example, appeals to traditional family values that might exclude gay communities or gay marriage, that might exclude women from entering the workforce, etc. I think are forms of political reinforcement of social structures, but I wouldn't necessarily call interpersonal violence political violence, if that makes sense.
I think people in this country have a right to, communicate, interact with each other, as long as they're not infringing on the rights of each other. They have the right to do that however they want to, as long as they're not violating each other in some kind of way, hurting them. I think that the political violence specifically, and you mentioned this, it needs to have a political element to it. And that doesn't just mean like men committing more crime than women. I think that it comes down to political violence usually has some kind of motivation with government policy, government action, ideology in general, but it's got to be ideology that is like government related, you know? So I don't necessarily think that interpersonal relationship violence would be considered political violence, but I can see what you mean about the structural pieces of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's at most an interesting way to think about things more than anything else. And so when we think about terms like political or structural violence, I think we use them as paradigms to understand issues. And I think it's useful, obviously, as someone who's a sociology major, to understand the societal factors and structures that influence certain events that happen, like interpersonal violence. But I agree with Wes that political violence is something that's tied to government innately.
All right. What steps do you think could be taken to reduce or even end political violence?
Yeah, I think that I think that a lot of at the core of political violence is a character issue for the people that are doing these things. You know, they've gotten disconnected from the communities that support them and help rein in some of their wild behaviors. Sometimes, I mean, I think that a lot of institutions within society that have arguably kind of gone away or maybe been are seeing much less membership now than they used to. I think that these, and I'm talking churches, social organizations, community service bodies, that kind of thing, that help support and uplift people, help support and uplift communities. I think if we recommit to those, recommit to being a part of something bigger than yourself, then I think that's the first step. And so that addresses the character issue to some extent within the country. I also think, and we kind of mentioned we both talked about this earlier, the education element of let's not be, a society that's easily fooled by the rhetoric of our politicians. Let's do a better job of educating ourselves and educating each other about, what we're seeing in the landscape around us, political landscape. That way we're not being fooled by people that are coming along, promising great things and, using inflammatory rhetoric. Let's be wary of that as a citizenry. And I think that all starts with education. And then the last thing I think is, and I touched on this earlier, we have to restore a federal system within our society. I mean, I think the founders didn't ever intend for our federal government to have its, to be involved in all these different areas that it's involved in now. I really don't think that in general, the federal government was intended to be involved in social issues at all. I think in general, it was intended as a national defense mechanism and as an economic collaboration entity, I guess, with the interstate commerce, clause of the Constitution. So I think they're restoring that federal system and allowing people really the freedom to move from state to state and have actually different policy in the states is a big part of it. So I would, those three things: focus on the character issue, the education, and restoring a federal system.
I agree with all of those points, maybe for the same reasons, maybe for other reasons. But I think that 100% community is one of the most important things in political organizing, and understanding that we are all people and we are all together and we are all part of something bigger, I think is not only one of the most important ways to organize politically. I mean, you can see the ways that every movement has centered around some kind of social institution or social movement or group. And I also think it acts as a self-regulating thing where people who are involved in community are less likely to commit those violent acts. And so I agree 100%. I also agree that education is very crucial. I think the genesis of politics, or the most important issue of politics, is obviously how we all talk about politicians are liars, and they frame things in certain ways to get elected, and you have to be able to be educated to see past that, to look at their actual platform points and be able to decide for yourself what you believe in. And I think it's very, very important that we're able to have civilized debate, and that we are all educated before we enter those debates to, really think and have developed an educated opinion before we talk. And I think those are all very, very important things. Finally, on the federal issue, I think the federalism, in the reality of the country as it is now, maybe is a useful thing to talk about, in the sense that we should devolve things to the states. But in the way that it is now, I do think that certain protections are important. Obviously, I mean, certain stuff with Title IX and a Civil Rights Act and reintegration, all of those things are obviously things that should be part of the federal government. But I do agree that a lot of the dissatisfaction that comes with government are with its size. I think that obviously, just from an administrative standpoint, government can't resolve everyone's issues when it is as large as it is now. And I think that smaller government being more empowered to do things for its local citizens and also its local constituents and their beliefs is a very, very useful way to prevent political polarization of violence, is to get involved in your local government, to change those issues, to empower your local government to represent you, and to continue to invest in kind of a further division of power into the states and smaller governments. I agree.
I think that another thing that I thought of when Yoel was just talking about it was, he mentioned something about frustration with politicians. I think that it takes us stepping up to provide moral leadership, to provide, bipartisan conversations. We should be the ones stepping up to lead, because I think that we probably all got pretty decent intentions. And I think that most people that go up to DC or go to Tallahassee, they do go with good intentions. I don't think they go intending to not represent the people that they serve. I think that just a lot of time they're forced into these frameworks and systems that just don't work for the American people on the administrative side, as you said. And so I think that it takes us stepping up, and that's part of that service element we just touched on, the community, is let's step up to serve our communities. And so I think that that's where it starts.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for answering those questions. Now we're going to go over some questions that our viewers have submitted through the QR code. The first one being, the idea that it was worse before or it's not that bad here creates complacency. How do we get over that hump to actually mitigate the violence?
I depends what you say about that. I agree to a certain extent. I obviously understand, being someone who probably is leaning towards the side of whoever asked that question, the understanding of like saying that it's not as bad here and this is the best country creates complacency. I think that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't resolve the problems that your country has. But I also think to a certain extent, you have to understand the privilege of living here. When I was talking to my dad about joining a protest, he told me, like, I worked my ass off to get you into this country so you could walk around wearing whatever you want with an iPhone out without the fear of getting robbed, and that's a real reality for people living in other countries. The freedom of speech, the lack of political violence, the ability to pursue the careers you want with obviously certain caveats is something that is should be considered when having these conversations, and 100% is something that you should keep in mind, that at the end of the day, crisis shouldn't be the focus. I think that what I'm getting at here is that the perspective that I'm trying to push is that you don't think of any of these issues as an ongoing absolute crisis that needs to be resolved. I don't want to spread paranoia. I don't want to spread fear or securitizing rhetoric that only causes more violence in the first place. And so that's why I'm wary with prefacing certain things like this isn't the country where political violence is as prevalent. That doesn't mean that these conversations aren't worth having. That doesn't mean that these issues aren't real and aren't worth talking about. I think at the end of the day, when you look at the realities of the political violence that does exist, the murder of Charlie Kirk, for example, a couple of years ago, there was someone in, I think it was Charlottesville, who drove a pickup truck into a protest. Things like that happening are 100% worth talking about, 100% worth resolving. The pay gap is still a thing for women and men. I think that there's still disparities in hiring people of different races or backgrounds or socioeconomical backgrounds into different jobs, access to education, mass incarceration. All these issues are still massive issues in the United States that should be addressed. But I think that none of them should be came to from a perspective of fear, crisis, or paranoia. And so that's what I was trying to get at with painting this as not a country that was so prevalent as far as political violence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it invokes complacency to acknowledge that we are the greatest country on earth. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that, because we wouldn't be allowed to have this conversation in a lot of other countries, So I think that a lot of it starts with everyone's got their own problems, everyone I know has some kind of problem, and some people have worse problems than others. But I think a lot of it has to start with, instead of focusing on what are my problems, what am I worried about? It's, well, what is my neighbor worried about? What are these other people around me worried about? And I think that when we change our mentality as a society away from just, well, what are my problems, and instead focus on, well, how can I step in to serve and help solve these problems? I think that that's where that's what you do to combat complacency.
Some great answers. Another question that we got from the audience is the issue gun violence or political violence? What's the difference?
You go with it. It's not gun violence. The gun can't shoot itself is what I go to. It's an issue of the heart of the person who's pulling the trigger. This person obviously, has some kind of problem in their head, or they've, fallen for some kind of delusional view on the world, that's what's causing them to go shoot someone. It's not the gun that's shooting himself. So I don't think it's a gun violence problem, which, y'all may disagree with me on that, but that's okay. I think at the end of the day, it comes to someone has to shoot the gun, and they're probably messed up in the head if they're doing that in the first place. So.
I agree, and I would like to add certain caveats, obviously, as to like my opinion with the issue. I think I've historically like always thought that gun control to the extent where like for many years I thought that guns should be banned altogether. I think that over time and over educating myself with the situation of the world, I think that I've come to realize how important the Second Amendment is and the right to gun ownership is in resistance. I think if you're left leaning, there's so many examples of historical groups that needed guns in order to resist. And we can talk about those anytime if you want to come up to me after the debate. But I think that the most important thing to talk about is that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be barriers to getting access to something that is so easy to threaten someone. The first rule of gun safety is that if you pull out your gun and you are aiming it at someone, it is to kill. Understanding that as the use of a gun and understanding the dangers of a gun means that there should be more thorough background checking. There should be restrictions on potentially what kind of guns you're able to use, what kind of modifications, who can produce guns, how can they be produced safely, how can they be produced on the books. I think all of that maybe lends itself to more surveillance and other issues, but I think at the end of the day, I think that barring access of people who potentially have mental instabilities or issues of character that are repeating and might induce certain issues with guns is something that should be looked into. And obviously there should be more background checks, more rigorous testing to make sure that someone can own a gun. But I do think that the ability to own a gun is something that should be guaranteed. Yep.
Yeah, I think we can, and I agree, I think that it's definitely valid to consider certain types of restrictions on who can buy a gun, those kind of things, but at the end of the day, like, it's the person that's the problem, So I don't know. I just wanted to reemphasize that a little bit, just because it's the person that's the problem in the first place. It's not necessarily the gun. Anyway, I think there's something else I was going to say, but I forgot.
I'll have one last thing there.
Sure.
I think that, I have a lot of friends of mine who are gun nuts themselves, and they all, are against political violence to that extent. And I think that the point of having background checks or restrictions on certain modifications or et cetera is because the person is shooting the gun. Yeah. So I agree 100%. Background check is on the person, not whether the gun is faulty or not. At the end of the day, I think it's the person who shoots the gun, and I agree. But also we should make sure that the right people can own guns.
Those are great points. Another question for the audience is, what effect do you think the recent restrictions on free speech have on the uptake of political violence? Those recent restrictions are not listed in the question, but if you guys have any thoughts, that'd be great.
I'm going to talk about what I know are recent restrictions. There's obviously the whole thing with Jimmy Kimmel. I am most likely not going to touch that. I think that the most interesting thing about recent restrictions on free speech is the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group. I think that the ideology and the movement can lead to political violence, but I think that obviously labeling something that isn't a group but an ideology as a terrorist group as a then justification to shut down protest is, to me, a very obvious political move that can incite certain things like calling in the National Guard to crack down on protests that are against your administration, which I think on just principle is wrong. I think people should be able to protest and demonstrate for what they believe in, whether they're right or wrong. And an administration who is disagreed with should not have the power to call the military on its own citizens when they're protesting. Obviously, to a certain extent, if the city and other people and their rights are at risk in the ways that we've described rioting, I think that the protest should be controlled and ended to a certain extent. But that doesn't mean that certain moves that I've seen by this administration indicate me to believe that they're moves that are meant to reduce the ability of people to protest against this administration, which on principle I'm against.
I'll touch on the Jimmy Kimmel issue. Jimmy Kimmel said what he said, right? He went on TV, and some people will say that he flat out lied. Some people will agree with what he said. That's not the issue. To me, and ABC is within their right to fire him. I think they're absolutely within their right as a private employer to fire him for things he says. The First Amendment doesn't protect you from your employer. It protects you from your government from punishing you. And so that's where the issue is for me with the Jimmy Kimmel issue. If the FCC really did threaten ABC, over what Jimmy Kimmel said, then that's a problem. That's weaponization of government to suppress free speech. But the actual act of ABC canceling his show, to me, is not a problem with them. They're within their right to do that. If they only did it because they were threatened by the government, though, then the Trump administration stepped out of line on that. So anyway, that's how I feel about that.
Any comments?
Yeah.
Okay. What causes a difference of opinion on political violence from the left and the right?
Aside from what issues justify it, which is obviously the innate disagreement of left and right, I think the issue usually is whether political violence is necessary or not. I think that people who are well educated in history, as the West definitely is, and I hope to be, understand that political violence is sometimes necessary and will obviously argue for that side. But I think that a lot of times, at least within the left, there's a lot of internal fractalization or fragmentation about whether or not peaceful protest is the only way. Or is necessary in a certain environment. So I think that at least most of the disagreement in terms of just political violence comes from whether it's necessary or not.
I think a lot of it comes from alternative facts. People are watching one news outlet and they're only getting their facts from one side. So they're only hearing about, Charlie Kirk getting shot or, a Catholic school getting shot by someone who disagreed with their beliefs. Those kind of things is what the right's seeing. The left is only going to see, the Minnesota senators that got shot. And so I think that's part of the problem is you have people receiving different information. I think it's also, and this is a little bit of a biblical reference, but it's the plank in your own eye. How can you get the dust, the speck out of someone else's eye if you can't see past the plank in your own eye? So I think both parties need to take a good look in the mirror and say, look, this is a problem for us just as much as it is for them. And there's a senator yesterday who, I don't know if it was yesterday, within the last few weeks talking about, there's all these examples of left-wing political violence. Well, there's plenty of examples of right-wing also. You can't just cherry pick them. And I think that both sides need to be responsible about saying, look, this is a country problem. This isn't just a left or right problem. It comes from the character, as we've said, time and time again in this discussion.
I agree. I want to touch on, I think that a lot of the issues with parliamentarianism, or at least with reaching out to the other side, is that oftentimes people come at it from a point of excluding people from the conversation. And I think that's a very, very crucial thing to talk about when you're talking with people who might disagree with you, is understanding that respect means that you respect their ability to have an opinion. I think that, for example, when someone maybe left-leaning comes into a discussion believing that all Republicans are Trumpies who are this and that and this and that, kind of using those derogatory terms to kind of exclude them from the conversation and not really listen to the root of what they're saying, creates the polarization and the political violence that we're talking against in this discussion today. I also think that from the right, when certain issues like this happened to me when I was tabling one over my freshman summer, and someone came up to me and started talking about how filthy and dirty immigrants are. And I moved here 6 years ago. I'm an immigrant, and obviously I do not want to engage in conversation with this person. Frankly, I want to maybe punch this person. At the end of the day, I think that conversation should come from a place of respect and including people in conversation rather than excluding them. And so I think that that's a very important thing when it comes to reducing political violence, is reaching across the aisle with good intentions.
All right. Another one of our audience questions, I believe this is from earlier in the conversation. What makes the U.S. the freest country than other countries?
Bill of Rights. I mean, pretty simple. Bill of Rights. I mean, the Bill of Rights protect freedom of speech, religion, protest, petition, all of these things. That's what makes us the freest country on earth. I mean, even look at the UK right now and some of the crackdowns they've had over speech. You're not going to have that in the United States for the most part. There have been some concerning things with media companies, but United States government is not going after individuals over their speech. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that makes us a free country. Second Amendment, as we mentioned earlier, it's those rights that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights that other countries don't necessarily have. That's what makes us the freest country.
I think that historically we haven't necessarily been the freest country. I think that's also important to talk about. Obviously, during the Red Scare, before the Civil Rights Act, during Jim Crow laws, during a million different examples when we were getting lobotomies up until the 50s and 60s, we haven't been the freest country. But I do think that right now, I mean, there's obviously no metric to quantify which country is the freest, but I do think that the United States is better to live in terms of political freedoms than most other countries. I can speak only from personal experience of, day-to-day life. When I went home to Argentina and I was walking around with my family, you can't have your phone out because if someone sees that it's an iPhone, you're probably likely to get robbed. Most of my family who's been in Argentina has been robbed at least twice or three times. I've been robbed myself once. I think that is a basic freedom that people have in the United States that you don't appreciate. But that doesn't mean that we're the freest country. That doesn't mean that we don't have issues that we should resolve. And that doesn't mean that historically we have been the freest country. But I do think that it's important to connote that this is a good country to live in.
And another one of our questions is, does the top 1% contribute to political violence?
Absolutely. You look at who's funding a lot of these groups. Actually, when I interned in the Senate over the summer, we had a group called Code Pink come through, and they're an anti-war protester group. They basically invaded our office over the Palestine, Gaza-Israel issue. And I looked up, and I was so frustrated by the fact that they got in my face and were screaming at me and basically, wouldn't let me speak, and I'm not that I really should have spoken anyway. But you look at who's funding them, and it's billionaires. It's these billionaires that are funding these groups on both sides. I think that you probably see a little bit more, well, maybe that's just me being on the right, seeing a little bit more, better examples, organized political violence on the left. I think a lot of time on the right, it's a little bit less organized unless you're talking like white supremacist groups and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's absolutely billionaires. One of this Code Pink organization that I'm talking about, the lady who was in my face, actually, her dad was a wealthy real estate developer in Long Island. She's never had to work a day in her life because she's had her dad's money to support her protest activities. So it's absolutely, funded by these people at the top.
I just several things to talk about. The first of which is obviously the classical explanation of political instability, which is class consciousness. Economic inequality and the difference between classes rising is something that innately is going to cause political instability because people are aware of how much of a difference there is between their lives and the lives of people on top. And so that's the classical explanation for why political violence happens, is because of economic inequality. And that's, I think, the contribution that the top 1% has to political violence is just by the innate nature of how they earn their wealth and how disparate, like how much $1 billion is to $40K a year, which is the average wage, excluding the 1%. I think about in between 40 to 70K. It causes innately political instability and political dissatisfaction. Now, as far as the term of the top 1% funding different political groups, I think that protest historically has come from the bottom up. I think that painting certain movements as necessarily being like mostly funded by rich people is like maybe potentially harmful, because when you look at the history of protests by unions, of protests by the civil rights movement, of protests by the Stonewall movement, the suffragettes movement, etc., have all come from the bottom up. They've been grassroots movements. And so I think that that's maybe necessarily discrediting the causes that they advocate for. However, it is important to note that, people with resources and nothing to lose potentially are easier to fall into those lobbying groups and advocacies. But yeah, what I'll say on the issue of the original question, which is what the top 1% contribute, I'd say is from a sociologist perspective, that economic inequality, which causes instability.
All right. And our final audience question is, do you think the placing of the National Guard in major cities is a level of political violence the U.S. people need to protest and speak out against? What is your opinion on those decisions?
That's a lot of questions in one question. I don't think the National Guard should have been called into Portland, Oregon, or to California. Just on principle, I think that like Portland, Oregon isn't a war zone. If you've been to Portland, Oregon, it's a shithole, but it's not a war zone. I think that As far as these protests, I think that they initially start as peaceful, and when you call in more of a military presence, that's what induces violence. I think that most protests innately want to be peaceful. People don't want to be rioting because at the end of the day, they fear for their own lives. But when they see in front of them the National Guard, that's what induces violence. That's what induces more violent clashes, polarization, of protests to turn into a riot, is the resistance that they face when they're protesting. At the end of the day, you can't allow maybe a protest to halt the entire operation of the city of LA, but at the end of the day, that should be a California issue, not a federal issue. I also think that it's only going to induce more violence to militarize. And so I think that potentially, as far as whether this is something that should be protested, I think so. I think that when the government sends in the National Guard to prevent a protest that is directly against its own administration's policies, it shows to me, once again, on principle, Trump trying to shut down people disagreeing with him, which is just a historical issue no matter who the president is, no matter which way it leans. I don't think any conversation should be shut down when it's protesting the administration that is shutting it down, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's a lot to answer, but I guess those are my thoughts on it.
I think it depends on the city. I think it depends on what's going on. DC, for example, is a federal city. Yeah, they had the Home Rule Act that was passed in the 70s, I think. But I was there this summer when it happened, and one of the things that scared me actually being up there was the very first day I started at my internship in the U.S. Senate, June 30th, there was an intern killed, caught in gang crossfire on M Street in DC. I mean, that could have been me. That could have been me. He was going to get a burger from McDonald's, and that could have been anyone. And so when you have people's basic civil liberties not being protected in these cities, I do think the federal government has somewhat of a responsibility to step in. And we've seen that demonstrated in the past, especially in the civil rights movement. I mean, the National Guard being sent into University of Mississippi, for example, or Little Rock, Arkansas, to force integration. I think that when civil liberties aren't being protected, that to some extent the National Guard does need to step in. Now, if it's to deal with protests, if these protests are violent, then maybe. Do the police need extra support in these cities? Well, if they do, then why not let the National Guard come support these municipal police authorities? I think in the example of Portland, I watched the summit the other day that President Trump had about Antifa. Some of the stories coming out of Portland were actually pretty insane about people, being beat up, the police not even coming in certain areas where some of these left-wing groups have taken over to block access to certain places. And so I think if you don't have the police doing their job in certain parts of certain cities, Southside Chicago, for example, which I think is probably where President Trump was sending the National Guard. I doubt it is downtown Chicago, where things are generally pretty clean from what I've seen pictures of and heard. I think if it's to support the local policing activity, which was the stated intention in DC at least, then it's okay. If it really is this government overreach of let's take out all the protesters, then absolutely that's wrong. But if you're supporting basic civil liberties, I think it's okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think that as someone who's usually in favor of protests and in favor of maybe large protests, I think that to some extent you can't protest forever. A city needs to function. People need to live their lives, people who are involved. I think that's what makes a protest effective, is to keep those things from happening. But I also think that to a certain extent, obviously from an administrative standpoint, this needs to end at some point. I think that if it was just the nominal extent to which they are supporting local police activities, then it makes sense to call in the National Guard. And obviously this is on the fly because we didn't prepare for these questions ahead of time. But I think that also it's worth noting that there's a difference between the National Guard and the police in their training, in their perspective of other people, and their ability to follow directives. Just in their nature, one is military, the other is police. One is a citizen of the city that they're trying to defend or trying to administrate, and the other is someone who came in from DC with training to essentially shoot to kill, as far as military training goes. Who's coming in to shut down a protest and only to shut down a protest, or at least to support the police in doing so. And so I think that we should be wary 100% of sending in the military to shut down protests. And I think it also depends on the situation. Yeah.
All right. Well, that about sums up all of our questions and our discussion for today. So quick, little round of applause for Ioel and Wesley.
Good.
And yeah, thank you again for coming out today and speaking on this discussion. For those of you who are new here or are now tuning in, unfortunately, we just put an end to our discussion, but you can scan the QR code to check in, as well as scanning the flyer over here to get involved with Common Ground UF. You could join our Group B, as well as follow us on social media for more future events. So yeah, thank you.